This was not a routine health update. It was a rare moment when the veil of control slipped from the palace, revealing a devastating truth. The woman who holds the monarchy's emotional center was far sicker, for far longer, than those in power wished the public to know. This was Prince William's nightmare. It was not the deterioration of King Charles III's health, a contingency long prepared for within constitutional documents. The real terror lay in the sudden, complete vanishing of Princess Kate. The fundamental difference between the two crises lies at the core. King Charles' illness was an institutional issue, manageable by protocol and law. But Kate's sickness was a struggle for the survival of the monarchy's human image. When the king falters, the clock continues to tick, and advisors can prepare for a transition. But when Kate disappears, the heart of the palace stops beating. They attempted to hide behind the word privacy. Yet, after months of absolute silence, that privacy transformed into a shield for concealing the painful truth, a strategy used to control the narrative and avoid unwelcome reality. William's schedule was cancelled, and no reassuring photo materialized. This silence was not an accident, it was strategy. William, the heir to the throne, was thrust into an untenable position. The pressure from the media and the explosion of social media conspiracy theories surpassed the control capacity of the entire palace machine. Every day Kate was absent, etched a deeper crack into the foundation of the old house with cracking walls. William was not afraid of taking the throne. He was afraid of standing on that throne alone. He feared that Kate's fragility would expose the fragility of the entire system. When an institution relies on a few humanized faces to survive, and one of those faces confronts mortality, it ceases to be merely a private tragedy. It becomes an institutional survival test. The nightmare had begun. The palace, which always desired to maintain a perfect backdrop like a theatrical stage, was now facing the moment the backstage curtain was pulled back. And William understood better than anyone. This silence has a cost. That cost is not just public trust, but the minimal transparency owed to the taxpayer. The first statement was a masterclass in controlled ambiguity. The surgery was planned and successful, the recovery private, and Kate would return by Easter. This simple, pristine narrative was carefully placed in the public square, yet it dissolved instantly when confronted by the grim reality of the ensuing months. The public was given a sentence, but they demanded a chapter. What followed was not a gentle period of convalescence, but a complete, almost chilling, vanishing act. For an institution built entirely on visibility, absence is the highest form of chaos. The true indicator of the crisis's depth was Prince William's unprecedented withdrawal. The heir to the throne, whose life is protocol, suddenly cancelled major scheduled engagements. No photo was offered to the public, not a simple, reassuring glimpse, not a wave from a car window, nothing. This was a direct violation of the fundamental rule of monarchy. The sovereign, or the sovereign's heir, must always be seen to be stable. The palace framed this as respecting a desire for space, but analysts immediately questioned the sudden, total void. This wasn't respecting privacy. This was panic management. The silence created a dangerous vacuum, which, as with all power voids, was immediately filled by noise. The clamor of speculation, conspiracy theories, and outright cruelty. The palace, obsessed with managing optics, found itself in a trap. They were more afraid of admitting the truth, that the situation was unexpectedly severe, than they were of the resulting loss of faith caused by their continued secrecy. This unwillingness to be transparent became the crisis itself. The institution's management of perception failed catastrophically. They expected the public to accept a vague statement and months of total invisibility simply because the word privacy was stamped on the file. What they missed was the modern requirement for connection. Kate was the emotional anchor, the figure who humanized the crown. Her protracted absence did not just cause concern, it signaled a malfunction at the very core of the system. You don't lose sight of a princess for months by accident. This enforced silence was, in fact, the greatest threat to the crown's credibility since the days of the Diana crisis. The king's announcement of his own cancer diagnosis, though shocking, was a crisis of institutional stability. It was about the future of the crown, a predictable and manageable line of succession. But Kate's silence created a crisis of humanity and relatability, a far more terrifying prospect for a modern monarchy trying to survive through public affection. William could handle the constitutional paperwork of his father's decline. What he couldn't handle was the complete absence of his most vital political and emotional partner. Kate was the monarchy's firewall, the one who absorbed public scrutiny, modernized the family's image, and provided the warm, aspirational counterpoint to the more formal figures of Charles and Camilla. Her presence meant stability. Her absence meant the system was exposed. Her illness, regardless of its nature, became a metaphor for the royal family's own vulnerability and mortality. The public had accepted the king's cancer with a degree of resignation, but the uncertainty surrounding Kate provoked an obsessive search for the truth. This obsession reached a fever pitch with the infamous Mother's Day photo. It wasn't the image itself that shattered trust. It was the admission of manipulation. When the palace confessed to editing the photograph, they didn't just break the rules of journalistic integrity. They shattered the implied contract of honesty with the public. They implicitly confirmed what conspiracy theorists had been claiming, that the palace was willing to lie about something as simple as a family photo, raising the chilling question of what else they were willing to lie about regarding Kate's true condition. For William, this photo fiasco was the moment his carefully constructed world of control dissolved. The narrative was no longer about Kate's health. It was about the palace's capacity for deceit. The backlash wasn't aimed at Kate for a simple mistake. It was aimed at the institution for trying to deceive the world. This failure in digital crisis management became William's defining public nightmare, forcing him to witness the erosion of public faith in his future reign before it even began. He realized the gravest threat wasn't a biological disease, but a disease of trust rapidly consuming the foundation of his future monarchy. The photo crisis was a tactical loss, but the real damage was the exposure of the deep conflict raging inside the House of Windsor. The palace machine, desperate to regain control, fought against the rising demand for truth. Yet, whispers began to escape the tight confines of the private apartments. Leaks from staff, possibly driven by a profound loyalty to Kate, fueled the speculation. It's worse than they say. This moment marked the true fracture, pitting William's natural instinct to protect his wife against the cold, calculated advice of the seasoned royal counselors. It was King Charles who ultimately shattered the stalemate. Faced with his own diagnosis and confronting the fragility of life head-on, the king saw the crisis with chilling clarity. He recognized that the institution, which he had served his entire life, was destroying the very people it was meant to represent. The fear of bad headlines could not outweigh the dignity owed to the woman who was fighting for her life. His decision was unilateral and decisive. No more hiding. This was not a mere change in public relations. It was a constitutional overruling based on raw human empathy. If a king has to overrule his entire court just to tell the truth, that's a problem. Charles's command was an admission of the palace's systemic failure, that the optics first strategy had reached its moral bankruptcy. He chose Kate over the palace machine. The king's decree set the stage for the next and most critical phase. The palace would no longer speak for Kate, she would speak for herself. William, who had watched helplessly as the institution he was born to inherit struggled to suppress the basic fact of his wife's suffering, now understood the full cost of that struggle. His father's illness had been a political problem, but Kate's illness became a moral survival test, forcing the monarchy to confront its humanity or risk irrelevance. The moment the king broke the machine, the entire script of the crown was rewritten. The stage was set, not by Buckingham Palace's grand public relations team, but by a simple, raw message recorded in a garden. The ensuing 94-second video was the most radical public relations maneuver the monarchy had attempted in decades. This was the moment the institution was forced to step back, yielding the narrative not to a spokesman in a briefing room, but to the vulnerable woman at the center of the storm. It was a failure of the cold palace statements, which could never convey the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a statement, it was a confession. Analysts immediately focused on the profound contrast. The setting was soft, the tone was quiet, yet the message cancer hit with devastating force. Kate spoke, not as a royal figurehead, but as a mother and a wife fighting for her health. Her warm, fragile honesty cut through all the media spin and the manufactured conspiracies. She gave the palace what the machine never could: honest vulnerability. By acknowledging the disease, she reclaimed her story and, crucially, demanded privacy on her own terms. For William, this video represented the necessary, yet terrifying, climax of the crisis. It brought an end to the destructive silence and speculation that had been eating away at his family's peace. Yet, it crystallized his greatest fear. The human cost of the crown's survival was now permanently visible. Kate didn't just update her medical chart, she rewrote the monarchy's script. Her video was a powerful, personal assertion that the palace's previous strategy of control and concealment had been entirely wrong. This 94-second video was a confession of the institutional failures of the previous months. It served as a powerful reminder of the fundamental truth Charles had recognized. The strength of the modern monarchy rests entirely on the genuine connection between its human faces and the public. By showing her frailty, Kate paradoxically gave the institution the strength and credibility it had entirely forfeited through its policy of secrecy and control. The collective sigh of relief that followed the announcement of Kate's cancer being in remission was felt globally. Yet, it was a relief deeply tempered by the shadow of the preceding months. The initial crisis had ended with the truth, but the subsequent news was not a full return to the fairy tale. It was a transition into a fragile future. The palace and the public were forced to immediately grasp the distinction. Remission does not equate to cure. This new reality is William's greatest and most permanent burden. His wife, the future queen, is no longer an untouchable symbol of health and vitality, but a figure whose strength is partial and recovery is conditional. Every scheduling decision, every public appearance, every long-term strategy must now be filtered through the terrifying question: what if it comes back? This fragility hovers like a silent, invisible advisor in every royal council meeting, altering the calculus of succession itself. The crisis forced the entire institutional machine to confront the fact that health is not optional background noise. The monarchy can no longer function on the assumption that its central humanizers, Kate and William, are impervious to mortality. The cost paid for the fight was immense, not just in public trust, but in the deep emotional toll exacted on William, who was required to perform as the stoic heir while his partner was fighting for her life. The narrative that everything is fine was irreparably broken. The joy of the remission update simply confirms the terrifying lesson learned. The monarchy now operates under a constant contingency plan for when a future queen must step away to survive. William's inheritance has fundamentally changed. His future is bound not just by the weight of the crown, but by the relentless knowledge that the continuity of the institution hinges entirely on the health of one vulnerable, yet intensely loved, woman. The institutional aftermath of the crisis forced a profound, visible shift in the monarchy's operating procedures. The realization that Kate, the future queen, could be required to step away to survive necessitated a total restructuring of protocol. The palace had to formally integrate mortality into its contingency planning, moving from the old assumption of invulnerability to the modern acceptance that its senior figures are also human. This was a massive political change, confirming that the health of the individual is no longer optional background noise. Kate's personal victory in managing her narrative ultimately became her greatest institutional legacy. Her decision to record the raw, honest video was the definitive pushback against the palace machine's instinct for secrecy. She demonstrated that in the 21st century, the public demands truth dragged out at the last possible moment, not glossed-over statements. Her vulnerability transformed into a powerful new model of empathy that the monarchy had desperately lacked. Kate didn't just update her medical chart, she rewrote the monarchy's script. The failure of the palace's secrecy confirmed the crisis began when the monarchy prioritized managing perception over reality. By being honest about her cancer, she gave the crown the one thing it needed to survive this particular test: authentic humanity. For William, this enforced transformation meant his future reign would operate under new rules. No more fairy tale monarchy. He learned that if the monarchy wants to survive in a world that watched Kate suffer in real time, it cannot go back to pretending nothing ever breaks behind palace walls. His burden now is to sustain this new contract of honesty, proving that the institution can adapt to human vulnerability. The final layer of this crisis is what it means for you, the taxpayer, the citizen, the consumer of the royal story. The core conflict was a profound test case. Can an ancient institution, funded by public money and reliant on global perception, genuinely adapt to human vulnerability? The answer, forged in the months of fear and finally delivered through Kate's honesty, is that the old system died. Your tax money and your attention are no longer funding a fairy tale, but a precarious political structure that has been forced to reveal its mortal flaws. The entire episode exposed the mechanism of power. Privacy was weaponized as a shield for management, and dignity was used to avoid answering the fundamental question of who knew what and when. Most people have no idea what Kate's announcement really changed. It changed the contract. The crisis illuminated the fact that the monarchy doesn't just manage feelings, it manages perception, and that's where the crisis began. The conclusion is stark and definitive. This wasn't just about a princess fighting cancer. It was about a system finally forced to admit it can bleed. The silence and the subsequent confession delivered a clear message to the world. The royal story is no longer one of invulnerability, but of constant contingency. If the monarchy wants to survive in a world that watched Kate suffer in real time, it can't go back to pretending nothing ever breaks behind palace walls. The crown must sustain the fragile contract of honesty that Kate fought so hard to establish. If you're tired of being fed polished palace lines without context, this space is for you. Tell me what you saw in that announcement. Do you think the monarchy has really changed after this, or just adjusted its PR? Don't just scroll past the royal drama. Understand what it says about power, secrecy, and the institutions that still rule over millions of lives.